This year we have Don Rising talking about the origin of the current Stowe Minutemen. And Don was one of the original members of the Stowe Minutemen when they were formed in the date I have is 1965. We were just discussing whether that was an official date or whether they were formed before that, but chartered or recognized in 65. But can you talk about a little bit about how the Stowe Minutemen came about? What led to it? How conscious were the people in Stowe in the early 60s of the fighting and the Stowe Minutemen's participation in the Battle of Concord in 1775?
I'm not sure how aware they were at that point, but people recognized that the bicentennial was not far away, and there was a lot of interest in preparing for that. Some of the surrounding towns already had minute companies. Lexington claims that they never were without one, that they kept theirs going all along. And Acton had put together a minute company, and some of the other towns around had as well. And I think it came out of the Stowe Historical Society with Franny Warren and Norman Castle being really the instigators of it all. And we, having an old house, had joined the Historical Society, and somehow I got tapped to be included in that committee to try to get something going. And that is what we did. Again, I'm not sure of the timing of all of that, but we did pull enough people together that we could march in the Concord Parade, and we did that by driving to Concord and then marching in our uniform, which consisted of a white shirt and dark trousers, which was not much of a uniform. That day was a little bit wet, and as I recall, there was still a little bit of snow on the field where we gathered in Concord at the schoolyard. But in '65, the minute companies were asked by the Commonwealth to participate in Massachusetts Day at the New York World's Fair. So suddenly our uniform of white shirt and pants were not appropriate. So we had to come up with an alternative. The Lexington Minuteman had quite a fancy outfit with Washington's Guards colors, and a coat and breeches and so on. We felt that Stowe, being a little bit in the country, we might have had something else, and with a little bit of looking around, we discovered that one option would be a hunting shirt. And we decided that would be the easiest thing to produce, and sizing it would be less of a problem. So that's how we began. We had to gather this all together in time for the World's Fair in, I think it was October, where the state was going to bus us into New York, and we would march in there along with the other.
To New York?
We would march at the World's Fair. We didn't have to march down the city streets. So anyway, we organized a sewing bee. Well, I guess I should talk a little bit more about the fact that we did have a bunch of members, and I can't remember all the names.
How many people were in the original Minuteman company, do you think?
Well, you mean the
the
revival of the Minutemen? Yeah. I don't know the number that we had. I can only think of a few names of people who were in it. Jack Head and Hank Childs, Dick Perkins, Harry Russell, John Sager, Bob Derby. Anyway, a few of them. Yeah. We may have had 15 or so people.
There's a photo of you marching to Concord at some point in the 1960s, and it looks like there are about 30 or 40 actually, by my count, just counting heads.
Well, marching to Concord occurred a bit later because we had to do some research to try to find out how the Minutemen might have marched from Stowe to Concord, on what roads they might have gone.
Okay.
So we think we determined the route, and that's the route that the Minutemen are currently using.
Which goes right through the Concord Rotary, right?
That's right,
Okay.
yes.
Was that a problem in 1775?
I'm pretty sure it wasn't,
Okay.
right.
Okay.
And some of the other roads may have moved around, but our research team did find an old road through the woods, going through the old Dewey and Almy plant, and then crossing the railroad and along through the woods and ending up in West Concord, which is the route that we now use, with a few interruptions from what must have been the original route. But that's a little bit ahead. The second year that we were in the Concord Parade, we drove to Acton, and then we marched with the Acton Minutemen on the Isaac Davis Trail. And we thought that was so great that we should then research and find our own route to go, to make it to North Bridge. But first we had to have our uniforms to make it for the World's Fair. So we organized a sewing bee, and the ladies were downstairs in the town hall with the tables there and sewing machines all over the place. And upstairs, some of the men were measuring out the cloth for the hunting shirts, which is just a, this is my old hunting shirt. So it's just a, just a shirt with a pair of collars, fringe collars that would help to shed the rain and so on. This is what someone might have worn in the woods or out hunting in those days. And we got the pattern for that from a booklet that, as I recall, was prepared by the folks at West Point, because they had been researching some of these things as well. And that gave us the idea that we could use that as a simple garment to produce, and then we modified regular trousers by cutting them off just below the knee and putting a band on them and a button or buckle to make them look like the breeches from the 1770s. And then we got hats, as I recall, from places like the tourist places in Concord, where they sold the tricorn hats. And we converted those over into what might have been more appropriate for our Minutemen. And that is, we took off the gold braid that was around the brim of the hat, ironed them so it was a flat brim, not a tricorn, and then just cocked the one side, but just the right-hand side, because that's the one that you need clear as you're firing your musket. And then we had a white cockade that we used to pin that side of the hat up to the crown, and we stuck a pine sprig into that as our badge. And that pretty much constituted our outfit. I think it was the Fry Boot Company in Marlborough was making shoes at that point in the colonial style. That is, they're not lefts and rights, they're all the same pattern. And they were made for buckles, so we were able to purchase those who wanted to. And other accoutrements were available as well as we were getting closer and closer to the bicentennial. Someone from Sudbury was importing flintlocks that were a sort of approximation of what people might have had then, but so a lot of us were purchasing those to use. I was the first captain of the Stowe Minutemen, so I didn't carry a flintlock. I had a sword.
Okay. And what kind of things did you do? You marched in, after the World's Fair, you marched in parades, basically, the Concord Parade, and I presume, were there parades in Stowe at that time?
We marched in the Concord Parade each year. We marched in the Memorial Day Parade. And we did go off to some other events. There was one in Rhode Island, I think, involving the Gaspé ship that was, the British ship that was taken over by the colonials. So we did travel around to a few other events, but we didn't do the extent of things that the current Minute Company is doing.
I was going to say, they do encampments and educational programs and research and things, it sounds like, I'm not sure that an approximation of a flintlock would be in their lexicon these days.
No, it would not be. And also, the hunting shirt really was out of place,
Yeah,
as were the uniforms of some of the other minute
that's what I
companies.
was going to say. The Washington Guards flashy stuff that Lexington, fancy dancy Lexington had wasn't actually authentic, was it? These days, I think they wear just sort of everyday clothes like the Minutemen would have had when they grabbed their muskets and left into.
Correct. Yeah, so there's a variety of colors and garments that are worn.
So that first Patriots Day parade, march to Concord, do you know when that took place?
Well, that's I'm not sure if that were 64 or 65.
Okay, all right. We're going from Stowe to Concord. That was several years after the group had been in.
Yes, when we marched on the Isaac Davis Trail, we gathered in Stowe and then drove, as I said, to Acton. And that day I can remember fairly clearly in '66, because my wife was pregnant and ready to deliver at any minute. And in fact, when we...
Bob Stokes was there, he has a medical kit for it.
Well, she wasn't marching along with us, though.
All right,
So we went over to Acton and then marched to Concord with the Acton Minutemen. And while we were standing around at North Bridge, someone came up to me and said, "Your neighbor took your wife to the hospital." And so we were standing around to finish up the ceremonies there out near North Bridge. And then next we were going to take a bus to Lexington so we could march in the Lexington parade. So I got a ride over to the Emerson Hospital from one of the Concord Minutemen, where he parked outside. I ran inside, and I think I left my sword in his car, and came back out again and went to Lexington.
You left after. How did she handle that?
Well, it was out of my hands at that point anyway.
All right, I got you. All right. So the Minutemen have been around for almost 50 years, a little less than that, I guess. But how long did you stay with it? What was it's evolved a lot. How long were the original members in it, and then what happened that led to its evolution?
Well, we kept picking up new members. The original one stayed with us for quite a while. We got a musical group started with a few people. I was captain up through '75, where we participated in quite a few of the bicentennial events, going into Boston when the Queen visited. And in fact, on Patriots Day, we marched in our regular route from Stowe Lower Village to Concord, to North Bridge, and then joined the Concord Parade to march into Concord. And then a bunch of us decided, since we're already doing this and the Minutemen continued on to Lexington, we could do that too. So we walked from Concord to Lexington, and then we marched in the Lexington Parade.
You didn't have to fight any British along.
We didn't have to fight any British, no, it made it a little bit easier, yes.
But that would have been authentic.
Well, there were some redcoats there, but they weren't in a fighting mood apparently. They were pretty...
So, you were the captain. Did being the captain mean you actually ran the organization, you got to give orders and stuff, or was it sort of outside of the marching order and all that, or was it more egalitarian? Or
It was pretty egalitarian and not even democratic, I guess we could say.
Okay. Do you ever, as the old captain, do you ever want to go back to the current group and tell them to shape up or something? And
No, they're doing a much better job than we were doing back then.
And it's quite different because now it's the women and children, it's a big family event, as well as activity, as well as a bunch of guys with guns.
Well, and we did have people who would follow us along, but not necessarily in costume, although some did put together appropriate clothing, the women did, and children for walking with us.
Am I missing anything really obvious that I should ask about the Minutemen? Obviously, the idea was to keep alive the memory of Stow's role in the beginning of the Revolution. Were people aware that the Minutemen was sort of a one-time thing, that they fought in one key battle, and after that they had to join the army or go home or something?
Well, they were the alarm company of something. If the British were marching out or whatever, then they were going to respond, because things were getting pretty hot then. So they didn't really continue as the Minutemen, but they did often go and join the army. And
40 Stowe soldiers served at Bunker Hill, and I forget how many, about 20 I think were at the Battle of Saratoga. So I forget the total number, but there were quite a few from Stowe who did serve. And as you go to the library, you can see a list of the Stowe soldiers who were killed during the war, or died during the war.
Yeah. We supposedly had 81 men. We had two companies of Minutemen in Stowe at that time.
It's a little infuriating. There really aren't very many records. Do you think they just didn't write anything down, or they got lost, or the records? I mean, not the soldiers, but we really don't know a lot about exactly who marched in terms and who stayed. There's a discussion that some stayed in Stowe because there were cannons and gunpowder hidden in Stowe in the woods, things like that. It's just a mystery.
Well, also Henry Gardner was the provincial treasurer,
Yes.
and there was some thought that the British might come to Stowe because maybe the provincial money was there.
Well, thank you for doing this. It's been very elucidating. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's been fun doing it also, and there are a lot of fond memories of the march from Stowe to Concord. I just give one example of that.
Sure.
We were marching, we'd gone across the Rotary, Route 2 Rotary, and we're on Barrett's Mill Road. In fact, we were just getting near Colonel Barrett's farm. And off to our left, we heard the drums of the Acton Minutemen. And they were coming down, I think, a Strawberry Hill Road from the left. And we looked to the right, and across the fields were the Sudbury Minutemen marching in. So the three groups of Minutemen were combining and converging on that one spot, and it was quite an emotional moment.
Okay. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.